Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's time to introduce our Wednesday weekly video series. And this one's going to be a little bit different from last year, but it's the same basic idea. We're going to be looking at college football through the lens of trying to find players of interest for the Seahawks in next year's draft. So basically, this is going to help get us really prepared for draft evaluations next season, and that's obviously going to be really valuable because we don't have an abundance of picks like we did the last 2 years, but we do have a full slate of picks and then some. And of course, next year's draft class is going to be trying to really put a bow on what we managed to put together in terms of young players over the last two seasons. So here's the idea. I'm going to talk about 5 players approximately at each of the positions of obvious need going into 2024. So these are positions where it's very clear that we're going to need to improve. We're going to need to add stuff. And I want to focus on those. I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about running backs. I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about running backs when I know we're not going to take a running back until like the 5th round in all likelihood. I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about wide receivers when we got some of the best receivers in football already and we're paying them all this money. I don't think we're drafting another one. So we're going to focus on quarterback, tight end, interior offensive lineman, defensive lineman, inside linebacker, and safety. And every week we do this, we're just going to look at 5 different guys that really stood out positively. It could be the same guys, but more than likely, other players are going to stand out, and we're going to look at those. And some of these guys are going to be guys I talked about before the season started. Some of these guys are going to be guys that appeared on my radar brand new as the season started. So by the end of the season, we'll have a pretty good idea of who stood out at these positions in college football. So since the college football season's already started, we already actually have some stuff we can look at. So let's go ahead and take a look here. We got a quarterback. We got 5 quarterbacks here. Honestly, it could have been like 10. A lot of good quarterbacks. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that every player pretty much here played against a terrible team because it's the first week of college football and they're all playing terrible teams. That's going to be the case for a couple weeks. So understand that some of these guys went off in a way that they're not going to go off in every game they play. So we do need to let that sort itself out. But with the data that we have, 5 guys that I want to single out here. Shedeur Sanders went off against TCU. Good team, by the way. Credible team, at least in theory. 510 yards, 4 touchdowns. He had 4 receivers who caught for over 100 yards. Crazy stuff. Michael Penix Jr., 29 of 40 for 450 yards and 5 touchdowns. 11 completions of 20-plus yards. Joe Milton III, he didn't necessarily have a monster game, but his team won easily. And this guy's just so much fun. This guy's got such a cannon. I'm already in love. He had 200 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and he also had 9 carries for 33 yards and 2 touchdowns. So he's doing it with his arm. He's doing it with his legs. He's got a giant arm. He was pretty accurate. Joe Milton III might be the most important guy to keep an eye on going forward. Bo Nix of Oregon, 23 of 27. Basically a perfect game for 287 yards and 3 touchdowns. Team put up 81 points. And I do want to shout out Jordan Travis because he had a little bit of a rough start against a really good LSU team, but he settled down and played fantastic football for most of that game. 23 of 31, 342 yards, 4 touchdowns, the 1 interception, and he also had 7 carries for 38 yards. So Travis really got it going after starting out poorly, I think. There are a lot of other guys that could have been here. Guys like Cam Ward, Caleb Williams has had an awesome start to the season, although I'm not really talking about Caleb that much this year. He's not gonna be there for the Seahawks. Same with a guy like Drake May. I think that Tyler Van Dyke even played fairly well. But these 5 kind of stood out to me the most, I think. So it's a nice QB class looking like. It was a great week 1. Moving on to tight end, 5 guys that performed really well in this first week included Benjamin Urosek, a new name, not somebody I've talked about before. He had 9 catches for 138 yards and a touchdown. 5 of his catches went for 20 or more yards. He's a Stanford tight end. He's not as big as the traditional Stanford tight end, but definitely draftable, definitely intriguing as we try to rebuild this tight end room next offseason in all likelihood. Next guy, Cade Stover. Cade Stover was awesome for Ohio State. He's not even really considered to be a pure receiving threat. He's like a Will Dissly blocking tight end, but he had 5 catches for 98 yards, 0 sacks on the Ohio State quarterback in that game, and they had 143 rushing yards altogether. It wasn't a great game for the Ohio State offense in general, but Cade Stover was maybe their best player, or at least one of their best players. He was a standout guy. Cade Stover played awesome for Ohio State, and he's a guy who I'm really going to be zooming in on when we get to the draft, I think. I like him a lot. Ben Sinnott would be the next guy. He also had 5 catches for 98 yards, 0 sacks allowed on his quarterback, Howard, and his team had 228 combined rushing yards. This is Kansas State, by the way. So Kansas State, they've got a nice little tight end here. This is not somebody that I knew about before, but he had a good game for KSU. 5 catches, 98 yards, and all-around dominant offensive performance. Luke Lackey, I believe that's how you pronounce it, had 7 catches for 73 yards. Another kind of standout week 1 guy. And Orande Gadsden II had a very nice game as well. He had 6 catches for 57 yards and a touchdown. There was only 1 sack allowed on Syracuse quarterbacks in that game. I think it was the backup too, so it may have been garbage time. And 271 rushing yards combined for that team, Syracuse. I think it's Syracuse anyway. So that offense was chugging pretty good, and Gadsden II was leading the way. Okay, one more offensive position. We got interior offensive line. Interior offensive line guys that I want to shout out here. Some of these guys I've already mentioned, but I think one of them is actually somebody who's new. Javion Cohen is the start. He he was part of an offensive line that was really dominant in their game against Miami of Ohio. 1 sack allowed on a Miami quarterback, and I think that sack was in garbage time. 250 rushing yards total from the Miami Hurricanes. 6.9 yards per carry, so dominant rushing attack. You can't say anything about it other than that he did his job great. Brandon Coleman, I think this is TCU. 0 sacks on... Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. That is Kansas State, actually. God, I've been staring at way too much college football stuff. I need to start putting the school name on this chart, actually. I should do that next week. But anyway, Brandon Coleman, 0 sacks allowed on his quarterback, and 262 rushing yards total in that game, 7.1 yards per carry. Really good. Got Cooper Bebe, 0 sacks allowed on Howard. This is the Kansas State guy who I really like. I really like this Cooper Bebe. 228 rushing yards, 5.7 yards per carry. Not a real team they were playing, but good results. And then you've got Ajane Cornelius, and this is about as dominant as you're going to find from a rushing attack in any college game. Ajane Cornelius spearheaded an offensive line that allowed 0 sacks on the quarterbacks and 348 rushing yards. That's over 10 yards a carry, by the way. No joke. And finally, we have the Duke guy, Graham Barton, who played against that elite Clemson defense and kind of ran all over them. Almost 200 rushing yards, 6.6 yards a carry, no sacks on Riley Leonard. So honestly, Graham Barton may have been the most impressive player on this list. Graham Barton, part of an awesome offensive line over at Duke. Okay, now we're going to go over to the defensive side of the ball. Defensive line, I didn't find that many guys who stood out to me, to be honest. I only found 3 guys. So I'm just going to focus on these 3 guys. First guy is Tyleik Williams of Ohio State University, Buckeye. The Buckeyes didn't have a great game, but their defense was on point. They allowed 3 points. They only allowed 71 rushing yards, 2.2 yards per carry, 5 tackles for Tyleik Williams. And he's like a nose tackle, so 5 tackles for him is a lot. T'Vondre Sweat, similarly, kind of in the same role. He's there to stuff the run. 5 tackles, including half a tackle for loss. 27 rushing yards allowed. Geez, 27 tackles. Now that would have been fun. 1.1 yard per carry against Texas. They were playing Rice. Again, not a great school, but you play who you play. So Texas's run defense was on point, and T'Vondre Sweat taking up a lot of space down there. He's key. 10 points allowed to Rice. Very nice. And also, Shamar Turner was somebody who stood out. And this is a new one. This is not somebody I've really spoken about before. 3 tackles, 1 for loss, a sack, 91 rushing yards allowed on only 2.8 yards per carry, and only 10 points allowed for his defense. There were a lot of guys who just didn't really do that much this week. Guys like Mason, guys like Leonard Taylor, guys, the top guys. Chris Jenkins even. I just didn't see a ton from them. I'll talk about them in the future when they do stuff, but I think those 3 guys were the main standouts for me. Linebacker, some pretty interesting stuff here. Junior Colson of Michigan, 5 tackles, 2 for loss, only 3 points allowed for Michigan, and 235 yards allowed. So dominant defensive performance for Junior Colson and his defense. Tommy Eichenberg of Ohio State also pretty much destroyed the competition. Now, the competition's kind of easy to destroy, but he did everything he could. 4 tackles, 3 points allowed, 153 yards allowed. So that's a guy who's fringe first round. I think he can get there. Cedric Gray was really good for UNC. 9 tackles, including 1.5 for loss. All sacks. College football does that thing where a TFL is a sack because a sack is considered rushing yards, which is really weird to me, but whatever. He played really well, and the defense allowed 17 points and 351 yards. They were playing Spencer Rattler's South Carolina Gamecocks, so it's not a complete softball. It's a weaker team, but it's not a terrible team. So Cedric Gray stood out. Another guy who stood out for me would be Curtis Jacobs. He had 10 tackles, 1 for loss, a sack, 15 points allowed, and 308 yards allowed on the head of his defense. Interesting guy. I believe he's the one guy on this list who did not have any representation on my initial defensive drafting scouting. So, new name, keep an eye on him. We got Danny Stutzman of Oklahoma. 4 tackles, which isn't anything over the top, but his defense allowed 0 points and only 208 yards. So, pretty dang strong. All right, so that's linebacker. Now we're just going to do safety. I don't have a ton on safety yet. I got 3 guys. Cole Bishop of Utah. Good game for him as they beat up on Florida. 11 tackles, including a sack. 11 points allowed, 346 yards allowed. They pretty much shut down Florida's offense. The 346 yards are, I think, a little deceptive. Some of that was in garbage time. A lot of it was in garbage time. Got Tyler Nubbin. This is another guy who I've had on my radar for a while now. 3 tackles, 2 interceptions, 10 points allowed for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Less than 300 yards allowed. Now, Nebraska doesn't have a quarterback. I understand that. He's playing life on easy mode until he plays a better team. But 2 interceptions in one game is going to get anybody's attention, I think. So, Tyler Nubbin of Minnesota, definite candidate for the draft. And final guy, Cooper DeJean, Iowa. 7 tackles, 14 points allowed, 329 yards allowed for the Iowa Hawkeyes. And that is all I have for the time being. Next week, we're going to sub in some new players. We're going to look at some new stuff. But that is the stuff that really kind of stands out to me early in the college football season. Let me know what you guys think down below. Going to definitely have a lot more coverage on this stuff later. As the year goes on, we'll get a better idea of who is actually the guys who are consistently killing it. So hopefully we'll start to get a really good idea of what the draft might look like. See you guys later. Go Hawks. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys appreciate it. Hope you guys learn something maybe. And hope you guys get prepared for this upcoming NFL draft. All right. Go Hawks.